Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this exciting book event with Diane Tober and her new book uh, on, well, titled Economics. Incredible title, which is a fascinating look into the world of egg donorship. So, as a brief introduction, Diane Tober is an associate professor at the University of Alabama in the Department of Anthropology and at the Institute for Social Science Research, and her work focuses on reproductive donation in the United States and around the world. Diane is a graduate of UC Santa Barbara undergrad, an MA from University of Hawaii, and also received her PhD from the UC Berkeley UCSF Medical Anthropology Program. Diane is a longtime colleague of mine. We worked together for a couple of years, several years ago, and I'm excited to invite her back here to campus and learning more about her work. So, Diane.
Well, thank you so much. Is this working? Yes. Well, maybe can I move this closer? No. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm really happy to be here, especially given that I came out of the PhD program here, and Dr. Cohen here was actually one of my mentors. On my project on sperm donation, so I'm very happy to see you here again, and to sort of come back home, so to speak. So, as a medical anthropologist, I've been very interested in sort of cross-cultural markets, commodification of the body, and the impact on body commodification on egg donors, sperm donors, and people who use egg and sperm donors. And I'll give a little bit of background first on what brought me to this work on egg donors. So back in 2013, there was a legislative bill in the state of California, AB 926, that sought to allow researchers to pay women for their eggs for research purposes. And under California Institute for Regenerative Medicine and California law at the time, that was illegal, that to pay for research eggs in the state of California. And so this bill sought to undo that law. And I was an associate director at a local organization called Center for Genetics and Society at the time. And on behalf of the organization, I was, one of a larger team in charge of leading the fight against that bill. And in the process of fighting that bill or trying to find reasonable amendments to the bill, I started interviewing egg donors. And a group had just started at the time called We Are Egg Donors, and they had about 30 members at the time. And so I started interviewing them and thinking about who might make a good expert witness to testify on behalf, against the bill, based on their experiences. And so in those initial interviews with the 30 egg donors, I was just absolutely struck by how many of those women had really serious, immediate complications that they had never been informed about. And the more I started to talk to more donors, it just became clear to me what the lack of informed consent, the reproductive harm that they were experiencing, and the financial coercion that was part of that process. And then as I started to delve even further, I started to realize that we have a very tiered market in the United States, where some people are paid more than others based on traits like education, race, and hobbies and other things. So I after we fought that bill in 2014, I left that organization and I restarted my research career at UC San Francisco with the goal to create a longitudinal project to look at egg donors' decisions and experiences and the impacts over time. So in 2014, I got myself situated at UCSF. I started doing the interviews with egg donors, and I collected in the first few years about 356 Qualtrics surveys with egg donors. Plus, then in about 2020, with funding from the National Science Foundation that I got in 2018, I expanded the scope of the survey, and I expanded the scope of the study to include egg donors in the United States and Spain, and I transitioned from Qualtrics over to REDCap, which is a more robust system for tracking longitudinal data and keeping track of, interviews, time 1 and time 2 surveys, et cetera, et cetera. So I built out a rather large system where people can come back and resurvey if something else, if they have a health complication, after a second or third or fourth or sixth donation. So there's 358 current REDCap surveys that I collected between 20 and 23. Now I think there's even more. And in the study, in the quantitative data, there's over 719 US donors, 129 donors in Spain, and 141 from other countries like South Africa, Taiwan, et cetera, many of whom travel here to donate eggs and then go back to their home countries. So there's a global movement of donors across borders. And then in addition, I also personally interviewed 265 US egg donors in person or over Zoom, 67 donors in Spain, and 70 donors from other parts of the world. I also did 20 US and professional interviews interviews in the US, as well as 23 in Spain, and conducted observation in fieldwork and clinics in both locations. Again, the initial research was funded by the National Science Foundation and the UCSF Center of Excellence in Women's Health. So that's just to give you a little background about the size of the study and the scope of it. And the reason why I was interested in the US and Spain from an anthropological perspective is that these are two different, very regulatory systems. So, for example, the United States, as I mentioned, has a very a tiered market in human eggs where some donors are paid dramatically more than others, and I'll get to that in a moment. And we also have flexibility when it comes to anonymity, and there's very little regulations on the industry, and also very little transparency in the industry. Now, compared to Spain, Spain has mandatory anonymity. They have a cap on egg donation compensation, and they also now have a registry that tracks the number of cycles that donors can do. So if a donor hits 6 cycles, six donations, or has 6 live births in a geographical area, her code is sort of flagged in the system, so no other clinic will use her. And another reason why I was interested in Spain is because I've been very keen to think about how can we start a registry here, and is it feasible here, and if so, what might it look like? So I was also interested in, do egg donors experience different health outcomes, or do they have different experiences in regulated and unregulated markets? It turns out not so much. And I wanted to think about the lessons that either country could learn from in terms of, like, how can we do this better? How can we reduce reproductive harm? And how can we have egg donors feel like they're treated, well cared for, and treated like equal patients? So ignore the numbers. I didn't mean to have these numbers on here, though I have a different slide. This is success rates, but I have this slide to show basically that these are some of the primary hotspots for the global market for human eggs, with US and Spain being 2 primary locations in which fertility travel occurs for donor eggs. So in the United States, we have, it's common to have these advertisements, often featuring, blonde women, or, women of a range of different ancestries, and saying egg donors can receive up to $48,000, become an egg donor, earn $275,000. But these things don't have all the information, right? They're there to capture the attention of a prospective donor and think, oh, well, I need that money to pay off my student loan debt, right? Which most US donors do use egg donation as a means to pay off debt, especially student debt, tuition, and so on. Now, what the ad on my right, on the far right, is saying $48,000, or up to $48,000. What that's not telling you is that you have to do egg donation 6 times to receive that compensation, 6 times at $8,000 each time. What it's also not telling you is that egg donation compensation is taxable income. So many egg donors are being 1099'd by the IRS. They don't know it. Then they get a back tax bill. I had one donor that had to donate again and again just to pay off her $20,000 tax bill and the back fees. So there's a lot of things that women aren't informed about before becoming a donor, and as well as also the potential risks that come with donation. On the right, you see earn up to $275,000, right? These ads are also a bait and switch. So what happens is that a person sees that big dollar figure, right? And then they contact the agency and they say, oh, I'm a Stanford grad or I'm a Berkeley grad and I fit the description. And so, I want to donate eggs. And then what happens is they're told, well, the intended parents that were going to pay $275,000, they already matched with somebody, but we can match you with somebody else, but we can't guarantee you're going to get that level of compensation. So then they end up kind of roping them in and end up paying them maybe $10,000 rather than the advertised $275,000. So I'm going to read very quickly, I'm going to read a little excerpt from one of the donors that I interviewed. Hopefully I can with my contacts. I didn't wear my glasses today. So, and this was, okay, I'll just start reading because that makes sense. It'll make sense, okay. So Ann Liu, born and raised in Silicon Valley, California, is 27 and the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants. She graduated from Stanford University with a full-ride scholarship and described herself as having led a privileged upper middle-class life, with many opportunities to pursue her education and various interests. I drove from my home in Berkeley across the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge up to the San Francisco Golden Gate and swerved along the winding roads overlooking the divide between the bay and the crystal blue ocean that stretched as far as the eye could see. I planned to meet her at her home amid the grassy waves of blonde-covered foothills where she lived with her partner, Rory, who identifies as transmasculine. Unlike most other donors, Anne sees herself as financially secure. But her partner had more than $60,000 in student loan debt and had been the victim of a for-profit college scam, rendering his hard-earned degree worthless. Anne explained how she started pursuing Craigslist job. So I have my Invisalign in, it's making me slur. Craigslist jobs and gigs for a short-term second source of income to help her partner pay down that debt, and stumbled across an ad seeking Chinese egg donors. She says, one thing I learned in being with Rory is that I feel like I have a lot of cis female privilege. I can use that privilege to help my partner in ways that he can't help himself. Unfortunately, Rory would probably not get picked to do something like this. And when I saw that ad, I thought, yeah, I check all those boxes. Chinese, SAT, score over 2,000, graduated from Stanford. I definitely meet those requirements. Then I saw they were offering $45,000, so I picked up the phone and called them right away. Once Anne called the agency, she was put through a series of online interviews with agency recruiters and then flew to Los Angeles for more interviews with the agency before being officially enrolled in their program. It's been the most laborious process, Anne told me. I never had a job before where you don't get paid until the very end. After months of screening and testing, and she began to have some reservations and worried about the potential health effects. Part of me is like, I really don't want to do this, but because it's been 4 months in the making, I'm too invested now to pull out. Anne's ambivalence about donating eggs is common. Not only are there potential medical risks from the hormone injections and egg retrieval procedures, but also the process is extremely time-consuming. She continues, because I'm Chinese, I get put in a different category. But then they told me that the couple who offered to pay me $45,000 had already matched with another donor, so they didn't choose me. So then I had a Skype call with intended parents who did pick me, and they were from Hong Kong, which I figured if they're willing to pay this much money, and they were asking me tons of questions about myself. And I figured they were really wealthy if they were able to pay me this much money. And they were asking me tons of questions about myself that were really bizarre to me. Even though I had a master's degree and they had my transcripts, they knew I had a 4.0, they still wanted to know what my high school GPA was, which I think is ridiculous. Then they also wanted to know if I had double eyelids, which is crazy because I'm Chinese. Chinese people don't really have double eyelids. They wanted to know if I had dimples. I was super nervous because they wanted me to be a specific BMI too. Then I started thinking, oh shit, what if they think I'm too fat? That's certainly something that I've been trying to distance myself with because I remember growing up when I lived with my Chinese grandmother and I was connected to my Chinese culture, she was always on me about my size. And the thing is, the intended mother is Chinese, and her husband is actually Scandinavian or somewhere from Europe. So it was interesting to me that although they wanted 100% Chinese eggs, and the child would not even be 100% Chinese, but for me, they wanted really, really specific things. And I was feeling like, oh my God, this is eugenics, right? So Anne's story really speaks to some of the ways in which donors are being selected for specific traits, and to the point of being very, very specific, even hand size, how they move, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things I found in my quantitative data is that while average and low compensation for donors per cycle is relatively equivalent across the board for all ancestral groups, the high donor compensation, the donors who are paid the highest, is only, it's $100,000 in my data for a white donor, about $80,000 for an Asian donor, and the highest a black donor was paid was $20-ish thousand, Hispanic about a little bit more than that, and other a little bit more than that. So there's a racialized hierarchy that really reflects, not only the supply demand dynamics, but also in thinking about othering and belonging, who belongs, in terms of fitting into this pronatalist commercial market. And another thing was really interesting to me too in my quantitative data is that right here, about 10 years ago, there was a legal case called Kamakahi versus ASRM. And the ASRM, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, had always had basically a guideline stating that donors should not be paid more than $10,000, except in extreme circumstances. Well, in about 2014, 2015, they settled, ASRM settled out of court to lift off the $10,000 guideline. So, and that is one of those things that has fed into dramatically rising prices of eggs, or of egg for compensation for egg donors. Another thing that also happened at this time was the lifting of the one-child policy in China. And so at the same time as the Kamakahi versus ASRM case settled, and the lifting of the one-child policy happened in China, you suddenly get a lot of people from China, mainland China, coming to the United States to do egg donation cycles here. Now, the highest I've heard from an agency recruiter in my book that I interviewed, she said that her organization had paid a donor as much as $250,000, and I've since heard over $1 million. So, and mostly, a lot of these are for Chinese ancestry donors, and they're also for the donors that, for the non-elite Asian donors, that where it's not a demand to have sort of a Stanford education and so on, at a lower price, they're shipping women from Taiwan to the United States to provide eggs and then sending them back. So there's all kinds of dynamics surrounding race and compensation and global pseudo trafficking that play into this market. So where am I in my time?
You're about 20 minutes in.
Okay. And you want me to go for about 20 minutes? Okay, so I'll do a couple more issues. So what drives that market here in the United States is that here we have intended parents able to select their own donors, right? They see an online profile, and that's on an egg donation agency website or on a clinic website, and they go through and they can click on like, do you want blonde and blue eyes, or what kind of degree do you want? So they can click on like a menu list of items and select their own donors. Some donors are very popular and they tend to be used quite often. In fact, many donors that are in high demand are sort of coerced into doing back-to-back cycles. So doing it 1 month, having barely a month in between, and then doing it again, which is harder on the body. And so that really feeds into how the financial aspect of egg donation operates in the United States in a way that doesn't happen in Spain. So in Spain, the physicians choose the donors on behalf of their patients solely based on phenotype, trying to be as close a phenotypic match to the recipient as possible. Now, of course, what the Spanish think is phenotypic matching might not necessarily be what an intended parent would think of as phenotypic matching. So, for example, again, there was one physician who told me that for his Asian patients, if he can't find a Chinese, for example, donor in Spain, he might be able to source a donor from Korea or from Peru, because there's a Chinese ancestry in many Peruvians. And so what is the doctor looking at versus what is the patient looking at? Well, the doctor's looking at sort of eye shape, right? And that's the sole criteria they're using to sort of match the donor and recipient, whereas the recipient might be like, well, wait a minute, Korean or Peruvian is not Chinese. That's not a match for me. And so they're not looking at the larger cultural implications of a child that goes into a family that doesn't look like their parents, but the Spanish physician thinks they do. But in any case, so they try they match as best they can, they say. The intended parents never see a profile of their donor. It's completely supposed to be anonymous. And often they use a facial biometric system by taking a photo of the intended parent and taking a photo of the donor and trying to match on as many of these facial biometric points as they can. But the one thing I think in Spain that there is no variation in donor compensation based on traits like we have in the United States, but there still are forces of selection occurring that are sort of eugenically informed to some degree, especially favoring white European intended parents. So a lot of French, Italian, and German and UK intended parents come to Spain for care. And also after during the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainian women are refugees now in Spain, and they are having to rebuild their lives and using egg donation as a way to do that. So they're highly sought after. And so I'll just talk briefly about the risks, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion. So egg donors are frequently told in the informed consent process that the risks are less than 1%. In fact, let's see, what I've seen out of my 617 US donors is that 10% of the donors in my study have experienced severe ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, where they have to go to the hospital or the clinic to have paracentesis, to have their abdomens drained of the buildup of fluid. And if left to sort of settle on its own, it can turn critical. So 10 patients or 10 donors in my study, 1.62%, almost died from critical ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Their kidneys, one had her kidneys started shutting down. Another one went into cardiac arrest and was resuscitated. Another one had her lungs collapse. And so these are very, very serious, life-threatening complications that can occur. But when the clinics say, oh, the risks are less than 1%, they're only talking about the most severe complications. They're not talking about all of the other things that can go wrong, like severe OHSS, hospitalized for like maybe internal bleeding from having their arteries nicked accidentally or something, and ovarian torsion. So when the ovary twists in the body because it has gotten too large with too many eggs and cuts off the blood supply. So, and this is just the immediate complications. As far as long-term risks are concerned, many donors in my study, about 30% have reported ongoing problems with their menstrual cycle, menstrual irregularities, hormonal irregularities, post-donation infertility. Now, again, with the long-term risks, it's very difficult to say cause and effect, right? Because just because somebody had been an egg donor at the age of 22 doesn't necessarily mean that at 30, when they have diminished ovarian reserve, that was necessarily caused by the earlier egg donation. But it doesn't mean it wasn't either. Without being able to collect more data and compare the sort of reproductive health of women who've been egg donors with those who have not gone through the process, it's really hard to tell. endometriosis is something I see a lot in the donors that I've surveyed and interviewed. People who may have had a family history of it but were asymptomatic, and then after the first cycle, second cycle, because of the hormone injections, they start to have symptoms of endometriosis. And I do suspect, because endometriosis is an estrogen positive affliction, that it can potentially be sparked by having too much estrogen in the body from the injections. And then I also have about 11 women with cancers, and about half of these were under 30. So one was 28 years old, a 10-time egg donor, had estrogen positive breast cancer, and they told her she was going to die. And there was no family history. She had no other genetic markers for breast cancer. And they ended up performing a hysterectomy and removing her ovaries and putting her on estrogen blockers. And miraculously, the cancer went away, even though they initially told her that she had months to live. So getting that estrogen out of her body likely saved her life, but she was no longer able to ever have children, and so it's dramatically changed her life. So gathering this information, I mean, one of the things that I want to do is to really start to try to follow women from their first cycle over time, and then see, what those health outcomes are and what kinds of things we're seeing. And I'm hoping to work with an epidemiologist to do that work. So I will, there's a whole lot more to talk about, but I know there's questions people have, so I will stop there and let you all open it up for conversation.
Great. So thank you so much, Diane. I'm just going to start off with a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I'm going to start with my most controversial question, which is,
All right.
how has your work been received by industry? So I'm sure you've had an opportunity to talk about your research with folk who are on the ground, doing this work. And I'm just curious to see what those conversations have been and what you can share with us.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. So some physicians that I've been in contact with have been very open to having these conversations and very open to the idea of egg donors, wanting to inform their egg donors and to know what they need to do better. But there's also a lot of pushback, and I don't know that the book has necessarily really hit the industry yet. I suspect that it will, and I suspect that there's going to be some caution, and there's also going to be some people saying, well, you've got some good points there, and we need to figure this out. And there's several, like, for example, there's one doctor I worked with who sent a number of patients, who basically let his patients know about the study, and about 100 of his patients joined the study, and he was very open to, let's figure this out. Let's see what's going on, if anything. And others that have been like, oh, I don't think I'm going to work with you, So I think that still remains to be seen. I would like to think that my work will sort of open some eyes and make some changes, at least possibly on the registry front and on the anonymity front. But we shall see. That remains to be seen.
Okay, great. So from the controversial question to the more mundane. So as an anthropologist, I'm fascinated by your methodological approach. And you talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk more about just methodologically how you framed this project.
Right.
What were some of the maybe challenges that emerged that you did not anticipate? I think we have a couple of grad students who are in the room who probably are thinking about doing field work in this area. So it'd be interesting to hear you talk about what does it mean to do, social science research on the ground on issues around reproductive technologies, and what are the challenges and opportunities in doing that?
Yeah. Well, some as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, some of the things that struck me were, just being in the field and people telling me things that they really shouldn't have told me. So people, when you're talking to them, will be very forthcoming often, and that sometimes is not in their own best interest, So, but you try to be responsible with the data, and you try not to throw anybody under the bus, and regardless of that. But in terms of methodologically, I've always been more of a qualitative person. So I've always, want to talk to people. I want to hear their stories and that kind of thing. But for this project, because there had been literally practically zero work done on the impact of egg donation on donors' lives quantitatively, health-wise, or their satisfaction with the process, I felt that it was really important to build out a quantitative component. And that was in part because of that bill that we were working against when I was testifying in front of the legislature the first time around in 2013. They brushed off the testimony. It was clear to see, and I'm like, And even the stories where a person was sitting there, Dr. Cindy Way, who had an artery nicked by a physician and almost was bleeding internally and almost bled to death because they didn't want to send her to the ER because the physician said, well, you're fine. So in any case, even hearing those stories, the legislature, they were all just talking to each other on the phone, or talking to each other, looking at their phones. They weren't even paying attention. And I was getting irate before it was my time to testify. I'm like, how dare they, but in any case, so I thought, okay, what I need to do strategically is come back with numbers, and that will make them listen. So 2 years later, I collected that first 300 surveys, and then I came back to them with my OHSS data and my long-term risk data and so on. And I made a brief and explaining why these amendments would be important and showing the numbers. And then I handed out the brief to each one of the legislatures, and they sat there and they read it. So I finally had their attention. When I saw that gave me their attention, then I'm like, okay, if I want to talk to medical professionals, if I want to talk to policymakers, I'm going to have the numbers to support this. And that's sort of why I started off. And not to say that, I created the numbers, right? These numbers came up organically from the surveys that I did and trying to get donors from all kinds of different groups. Yes, some are from the We Are Egg Donors advocacy group, but some are also from, clinics and agencies where they referred them to me directly. So, and many, there's many stories in the book where I followed donors over time. There's some donors that I've known for 10 years. And seen their at first they were fine. The first 2, 3, 4 cycles they were fine. Then all of a sudden, cycle 5, it's like all hell breaks loose, and they're hospitalized or what have you. So yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
I just want to say I'm just totally overwhelmed. I'm just totally overwhelmed, Diane.
Thank you.
I'm just full of respect and admiration,
Oh, thank you.
and thank you so much. This is really wonderful, and it's so important. It's so important. It has such effects on people. So I'm very, very grateful and just in awe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Others?
Hi, my name's Alex Torres. I use they, them pronouns. Apologies for the voice.
problem.
I'm a little towards transition, so testosterone's really taken out on my vocal cords. My question for you is that I was hoping you might speak a little bit more about how the professionals you interviewed make sense of their process in the US context of how they decide to accept or reject a potential donor, and how the algorithms at play in the initial screening might actually perhaps be constructing an artificial supply demand between different racial categories in the United States. Renee Ameling has said a little bit of this in her work, Sex Sells, as well as other researchers in sociology
Right.
that look at this construction of the market. So if you could just provide like a little insight onto maybe your experiences with the professionals and how they're making sense of
Right.
this process.
Yeah, there is a lot of that in the book, and also, I mean, the field has changed dramatically over the last. Sex Sells came out in 2011, and the field has changed dramatically since then. And so, what the professionals often say, well, there's multiple levels of things to address about what the professional perspective. First off, they're running businesses, right? So they want donors that they're going to be able to sell. Okay, because if they're using frozen eggs, if they're freezing eggs and they have an egg bank, they don't want those eggs sitting in the bank on ice, because that's not going to generate any income for for the bank. If they're matching intended parents on a one-to-one basis, the intended parents are doing the selection. So it kind of depends on what kind of business you're talking about. If it's a private clinic that's doing, one-to-one donation cycles where you have one donor to one recipient, that's going to be a different dynamic than an agency that's appealing to elite clients versus an agency that's appealing to, a broader spectrum of, people in the United States or from abroad. And the thing is like they know where their patients come from. They know where their fertility clients come from. A lot of people are coming from Italy. Now that's kind of closed down because of some of the laws that are passing in Italy. But so they know their market. And they know what people are signing up to become patients through those clinics, and they know sort of because they've been in this field for a very long time. They have a sense of who's going to sell and who's not. Whose profile is going to be appealing and whose would not. So they do have limitations on BMI, not only size, not only for appealing to an intended parent. Recipient, but also medically, if people that are larger need more hormones, right, to stimulate. So they want to keep it using thinner people. They need less hormones, so it's a cheaper cycle, right? But in any case, so on the one hand, the agencies have a market, they know their market, and they recruit to be able to sell to that market. And on the other hand, there also are some people that are weeded out with the assumption that they're not going to be high demand. So, for example, back when I was doing work on sperm donation, I was doing interviews at the sperm bank over here, and the sperm donor recruiters were telling me things like, well, we have a shortage of African-American donors. We really need more, African-American donors or more Hispanic donors. Well, then a Hispanic donor or African-American donor would come in or, to inquire about becoming a donor, and they would be like 5'5" or whatever, which was below their height requirement at 5'7", I think. And some recipients I talked to said, well, we don't care if we have a donor who's 5'5" or 5'6", who's as long as he's Hispanic or as long as he's Black or whatever. So some like you said, some of the parameters they put on the donors are sort of their own imagination of what will sell versus what won't. And there could be clients that would still want sperm from somebody who's 5'5" or 5'6", as long as he has other kinds of things that they're also looking for. So some of it is artificial, but a lot of it is just really market driven in terms of who's going to pay what for what, right? Did I answer your question? Okay. Was there another element to it, or?
I will go through
Okay.
what you said, but thank you for your
Okay. And then another element to it is, well, I know, especially like, for example, again, in my other book, Romancing the Sperm, in the LGBTQ community, there was a lot of talk about people trying to find people who were like trans donors, and for a family that was mixed of, what have you. So and not being able to find them. So that is another consideration. So people would tend to make more private arrangements rather than going through the sperm bank type systems, right?
Well, first, thank you, Diane. So I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask two: one policy, one pragmatic, and one more comparative. If there's time, there's more. But the policy one is just: have you been able to create inroads with U.S. or global media to drive the policy and ethical concerns that your work raises, because it seems so important and your work so powerful? And then the second question is, so is the media interested in this or not? And in what ways? So that's the kind of question. And then the comparative question is, I'm thinking through the complex relationship between the politics of surrogacy and the politics of compensated egg donation. Because in both cases you have persons who are incentivized to give over eggs or their reproductive tracts for the desires of others, in both cases where there is potential terrains of harm and risk.
Right.
In the case of surrogacy, central to how it's organized is through the production of multi-stranded affective relations
Right.
between donor and recipient,
Yeah.
but complicated because they are both affective, but it's also a business, and affect is tricky.
Right.
In this case, through anonymization, however variable, there is the presumption that the ethical lies in preventing any kinds of affective relations, which on the one hand means that recipients are able to view their donors as simply non-human
Right.
sites for things, and don't have to entertain the violence they enter into. Whereas in the case of surrogacy, recipients do, but they produce all these forms of narration to
Right.
sidestep the potential harm. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering, so it isn't that anonymization versus none is simply the solution to the ethical problems, but it's an interesting contrast, and I'm wondering if that's relevant.
Yeah, so I'll tackle the easiest question first, which is the amount of media attention has been enormous. I mean, I get a media request at least once a week. I've been interviewed in Bloomberg, several Bloomberg pieces. I've been interviewed in Wired, Forbes, you name it, and Atlantic, some of the really top tier media outlets. Sometimes it's like, oh God, if one more person tells me they want to pick my brain, I'm just going to like scream. But on the other hand, it's obviously very important to the work. So yeah, and globally too. I've been interviewed for presses in the UK and Taiwan, Europe, Germany, Die Zeit, Die Welt, those kinds of things. So yeah, so there's been a lot of media interest, mostly on sort of the glossy, commodification stuff and eugenics stuff, the harm, also the risks. So there's a huge media interest. And to get to the other question about surrogacy and egg donation and sort of navigating those relationships in each of these kinds of contexts, it's very complicated. So, obviously if you have, an anonymous situation, it's very easy to just think of the eggs as like, no different than this mouse, right? It's like just another product that you need to fix your problem. You can't have a child, whether physically or what have you. It's a way to fix that problem, a means to an end. And I think a lot of clinicians see donors that way, donor eggs that way, and so it's very easy to sort of separate the eggs from the human that created them. And I think that's what leads to a lot of these very dehumanizing practices. At the same time, a lot of the donors that I've spoken to, and also intended parents that I've spoken to, not for the book, but just in general, there's this notion of wanting to include the donor to a degree, to have her be known to a degree, but with a limit, right? And if the donor pushes that limit, like say, for example, one of the people I interviewed, she has ADHD, and she's also in the book. She has ADHD. She was a known donor from the outset, and the intended parents said, "Yes, we're going to tell the child." That was in their contract. They're going to tell the child as soon as they can, and she's been around the child and the family. She's traveled with them. She's went to Europe with them and so on, and they've had a very good relationship, and she's been able to be a part of this child's life. But the child also has ADHD. And she knows, having been raised with ADHD, that what her parents did for her in putting her in sports programs and putting her in activities that really helped her, and also giving her structure and guidelines to address her neurodivergence, that really saved her, she said, and it gave her sort of a way forward to excel in ways that she wouldn't have had she not had that structure. Well, lo and behold, the child is 11, 12, 13. The parents still haven't told the kid that he's donor conceived, even though he sees the donor on a regular basis. Now the kid is acting out towards the donor as well as towards the parents. She's like, well, can't you tell your child now? Oh, it's not a good time because, my wife is having health problems, or it's not a good time because now we're going through a divorce, and so on. So this child is acting out, and she, as the donor, really wants to say, I know how we can help him. I can help you help him. You need to give him, structure. You need to not be so permissive, and so on and so forth. But she's in a very strange situation where she's a mother and she's not a mother. And these kinds of things I see happening all the time, is even with known donor relationships. With the one donor was sort of coerced. She was 17 years old. She was sort of coerced to provide eggs to her sister, her half sister, who was like 20 years older than her. And having done that donation completely, she ended up getting ostracized from the family because the family didn't feel like she was appropriately attached to the child as an auntie, and the mother felt threatened by that relationship. So there are situations that I have, like I said in the book, that worked out well, where there's been sort of not a co-parenting, but a donor involvement in the life, but it's precarious, and it's especially precarious for the donor because her access can be pulled at any time, regardless of her level of attachment. And there's no legal protections for her.
Others? Oh, you?
No, not yet.
No. Okay.
Oh, it just seems so complicated. Of course, culture is, and people are, and that's why we love ethnography. I know that your work was with the donors, but I'm wondering if you worked enough with the associations that handle things to know whether or not they had formal or informal ways of evaluation, looking into issues. And then, of course, they've got their advertisement stuff. And I don't know if different people work on the advertisements or if there's any interaction between the administration of the whole program and the. So I'm kind of wondering, how do they try to look into problems in a formal or informal way to try to improve things, or not?
Not at all. The marketing side is one side. So they have the marketing side that makes those glossy ads, that entices the donors to to call in, and then there's absolutely no follow-up. Prior to donation, a donor might get, say, either a 5-minute interview with a psychologist or maybe an hour interview with a psychologist. It depends. It varies from clinic to clinic or agency to agency. But once those eggs are out of her body, that's it. There's no follow-up of any kind. And donors they're often assigned an attorney from the clinic to the clinic has a sort of a body of attorneys that they work with, and sometimes the intended parent and the recipient have the same attorney, same lawyer drawing up the contracts for each, which obviously is a conflict of interest. Other times the clinic will appoint a lawyer for the donor and a lawyer for the intended parents, so they have separate lawyers, but it's still that lawyer, his or her money is coming from the clinic. So it's still not an independent legal representation that a person should be entitled to enter into something like this. And then, to add insult to injury, if a donor has a complaint later, whether it's a medical complaint or a complaint like the intended parents aren't performing what they agreed to in terms of letting me have open identity, et cetera, or being a known donor, they have no recourse. So donors aren't necessarily even considered patients under HIPAA. They don't even necessarily have the rights to their own medical information. So I've had donors tell me, for example, that they tried to get their medical records years later or right at the time of donation, and the clinic denied them their records, saying that they belong to the intended parents who were the paying patients. And so this whole idea of what is her status? And I have donors repeatedly tell me, I don't feel like I'm treated like the real patient. I feel like I'm just a cash cow for them. My doctor told me I was an egg machine. These kinds of things, these dehumanizing kinds of things where they don't, even if it's in black and white and signed on the dotted line, those are not upheld because she was paid and that was a contract and it's not legally binding. So, and there's no follow-up. And that would be something that would be really helpful, yeah.
So I have a question. So I'm interested in kind of the funding structure of these companies that are participating in assisted reproduction, and a lot of that's being shifted now by two words: private equity.
Private equity.
So I'm just going to say those two words and hand it over to you.
Yeah. Well, it's been very interesting. So the private equity, as we all know, has entered into all kinds of medical spaces, from veterinary to nursing home care to hospitals, et cetera, and to the demise often of patients. Because when you have private equity, the model is to come in, milk the whatever it is that you invested in for all it's worth, extract what you can, and sell and get out and get on to the next project. In the fertility space, what happens is that these private equity groups are buying up multiple clinics and anything that's associated with reproductive science. So they're buying up cord bank labs, they're buying up egg and sperm banks, they're buying up anything that's related to genes, genetic sciences, et cetera. The idea to create turn somatic cells into sex cells is also a huge thing. So a lot of eggs are being siphoned off to do research on being able to create gametes. But in any case, what has also happened is that now that we're able to freeze eggs, which again happened around 2014, through a process called oocyte vitrification. So people can now freeze their own eggs to save them for future use, and people can also, it's opened up a new model that's far more profitable than the old model of one-to-one fresh donation, where all the eggs are used fresh or they're turned into embryos right away. And so now what happens is you have private equity entering into these clinics and changing the entire culture of the clinic. And I saw, in the past 10 years, with at least 5 of the US clinics and at least 5 of the Spanish clinics that I've worked with, they've gone from private clinics to being private equity backed. One was Clínica Chamberí, I call it in the book, sorry, that was founded by a reproductive endocrinologist who then retired. And I started my work in Spain in his clinic. And then from the year that he's agreed to let me participate in the research, and then the following year when I went back, suddenly it was bought out by a global private equity group. And the culture shifted overnight. Walking in the door, it was like a completely different feel to how the clinic had been before that. And then one of the doctors, so there had been a huge turnover in staff. They, instead of having a chief medical officer run the clinic, they had a chief financial officer in charge of the clinic, whose main goal was to expand the European market. She, I believe, was from Netherlands, and she was trying to expand to to Norway, to Netherlands, to Denmark, to all these other European countries, and so it was very financially focused. The patient time with the doctor and the donor time with the doctor went from a half an hour to 45 minutes down to about 10 minutes. So it's constant turnover and churning out of patients, churning out of donors, procuring the eggs. And also many of the physicians felt an extreme amount of stress working under this PE system. And some of them that I spoke to, where I also did some observation work, left that clinic and started their own private clinics, and now being the founder of their own private clinic, they have more autonomy and have more work-life balance than they had when they were working in a private equity-backed clinic. And now they can spend 30, 40 minutes with their patients rather than the 10 minutes they were told before. But back to the vitrification of the eggs. So in Spanish clinics, the clinic owns the eggs. So you have a donor come in, the clinic owns all the eggs she produces. Unlike in the United States, where you often have one-to-one arrangements where, say, if a donor produces 30 eggs, the intended parents receive all 30 eggs to turn into embryos or what have you. So in Spain, if that donor produces 30 eggs, you might have, say, one couple from France, for example, receive the first 5 of those eggs, and then the clinic will have the husband's sperm on hand, call them up and say, hey, we got this donor, and we ran you both through PhenoMatch, and you phenotypically are a good match, and we think she's going to be a great donor for you. Do you want me to go ahead and fertilize those eggs? I mean, I saw this happening on a daily basis. Do you want me to go ahead and fertilize those eggs? Then the person in France says, oh yeah, great, thanks. So they'll make embryos out of the eggs, the first 5 eggs of that donor, and then the next thing you know, the doctor's on the line with another couple from Italy. Hey, we got the perfect donor for you. Blah blah blah. Same thing, another 5 eggs, and then if there's, say, 20 left over, they might freeze them and save them, distribute those later. But because the Spanish system, the clinic owns the eggs, they also get to sort of maximize the profits from the eggs. And that's the same kind of model we have now here with egg banks that we didn't used to have. And so the profit margins or the profit potential from frozen eggs has increased dramatically over what the profit potential what would have been over just fresh eggs. And I have some figures in my book if you do you want those? So here it is. So for example, in my chapter of frozen futures, if you have one donor to one intended parent, the intended parent pays $41,000 for a fresh cycle, with one donor producing 30 eggs. The donor is paid $7,500. The total to the clinic is say $33,000, right? After taking out the donor compensation. If you had a shared donation with one donor and two intended parents, each of the intended parents pays $30,000. The clinic can get $52,000. If you have one donor with multiple intended parents, so she's doing a frozen cycle, if she has those same 30 eggs, it's $22,000 times 6 eggs per batch, and with the ability to make $132,000 total minus the donor fee of $7,500, the clinic can yield $124,000. So that jump from $33,000 from a one-to-one cycle to $124,000 with $124,000 with a frozen cycle with the same number of eggs, same donor compensation. Now, if that donor produces 78 eggs because she's aggressively stimulated hormonally, not only do her risks go up, but so do the profit margins. So substantially.
Right. And then as a follow-up, do you have a question? Right, great.
If your question's
Nope.
a follow-up. Okay. So, okay. Let me synthesize them in my head. So it seems like there's massive demand for this because I don't know. I've been receiving these ads for like 10 years every single time I go online, which I think is interesting. Like that was the second slide. I feel like it's been like, oh, are you blonde or did you play tennis or any specific thing like might pop up in these ads, which I think is so interesting. Yeah. So it seems like there's massive, massive demand for this. And I guess my curiosity would be like, what do you think a path forward for this industry would be that would be less predatory toward like potential parents and potential donors? Right. And do you think that looks more like the Spanish model? What do you see as the downfalls of the Spanish model? Right. I'm curious.
That's a good question. What would a
look like eugenics?
Well,
I do think the eugenics angle of it is bizarre.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, we need to remove the compensation amounts from egg donor ads and have the risks listed on egg donor ads because that one thing is enticing people to get to the door. And people might not necessarily, people still know about it. We all have heard about egg donation, especially like you get those targeted ads. When you get a little older, it's going to be egg freezing, and that's the way I guess the world works right now. But in any case, I think getting rid of some of that financial inducement would be a good start. It's not going to solve the problem, but at least would be a start. The Spanish model, there's some things I like about it and some things I don't. Right. It really disturbs me that we have this hierarchy in compensation based on traits in the United States. I think that's kind of gross. At the same time, in the Kamikaze decision, the argument was, well, if I can get $200,000 for my eggs, well, why shouldn't I get what I can, right? Because it's my body, and it's my choice, right? And so I can understand that argument, and at the same time, I find it, the way it plays out on the ground to be problematic. In the Spanish system, I think that the model of having equal compensation is to some degree it feels better, but at the same time, there's a strategy to that. It's price fixing, right? If the clinics all agree, we're going to pay 1,300 euros, and we're not going to pay more, then they're not going to have to compete to get the donors, right? Because they're all paying the same. So I see that as a problem. There was another part of your question that I wanted to address, and I can't remember what it was.
Is this eugenics?
Yeah, it is eugenics. Yeah, and it's eugenics that plays out differently in different places, right? Yeah. So in Spain, it still plays out, but in terms of who gets selected to become a donor, but it doesn't play out in terms of how much the donors are paid, right? What could make it better? Well, in my final chapter, actually, it's called Just Eggs. And I wish I had time to read it. I don't know what time we're at right now.
About 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. And in the final chapter, there was a African-American donor who wanted to donate eggs, but she did a lot of research, and she didn't want to be, it's very powerful, her story. She didn't want to be paid to donate because, as she said, I know what it feels like to have, my ancestors were bought and paid for, right? So I don't want any child that's born from my eggs to feel like they were a commodity, that they were bought and sold. So she decided she didn't want to receive compensation. She did, however, want to freeze her eggs. So she started doing research and ultimately found a place where she could donate half and freeze half, right? So she still was compensated, but not direct monetary payment, which felt better to her. Another thing that she wanted is to have an open relationship with the intended parents from the outset. And again, tracing back to the legacy of slavery, she said that I know what it's like not to know where I come from. I would like to know if I'm from Kenya or Nairobi or wherever, and I don't have that information. And I don't want a child that's born from my eggs. I don't want to contribute to their loss of identity. At least they can still be connected to me and have that identity, right? And so then she went to a clinic the first time, and she told the clinic what she was looking for in having a known donation, and the clinic told her, sorry, it has to be completely anonymous. You won't even know the outcome if they get pregnant or not. And she's pushed back and said, well, I really want to be known. That's very important to me. And the clinician or the recruiter told her, well, you're not going to be able to find Black families that want to have a known donation. And she said, well, I'm pretty sure I can find a Black family that shares my values because I came from one. So she pushed back and she left the clinic, and she also shared with me that she has an advanced degree from an Ivy League. She has money, she's successful, she's working for a Fortune 500 company. And she said, if I needed the money, I might have done it otherwise. But because I didn't need the money, I had at least financial privilege to advocate for what I want and to do it in a way that I thought was the most ethical way possible. So her story really provides a model, in my mind, of what it might look like if we had egg donation grounded in human rights and reproductive justice, rather than grounded in a commercialized tiered market. And I have a number of things listed of things that I would like to see that would make things better for donors and better for intended parents, and especially better for the children conceived from donation. But that's one of the things. And thank you for that question. That was a great way to.
We have time for one more question. Oh,
Yeah. Oops.
you can ask both of them. How about we'll ask them back to back, and you can answer them both.
2 fast questions.
I'm not sure how fast this is, but sorry. Thank you so much for the talk, Dr. Tober. It was very interesting. I've also received ads to donate my eggs for a few years, and they're very disturbing. My question is similar to the last point you were making about the history of slavery and other people owning someone's biology in a way. And I've heard some discussion of this in regards to biobanks for research, right, and how there are certain slavery laws that do come into play. And there are ways of circumventing that language when there are questions of ownership of cells. And I'm curious if you've run into that. And I'm also curious, along the lines of informed consent and HIPAA, I guess you mentioned the donors are not protected by HIPAA. Mm-hmm. Is there biodata ever shared with like third-party vendors, like insurance companies, like life insurance, health insurance? Do you have any knowledge on that scheme?
I do not have any knowledge on that at this point. I assume that their genetic information that may have been taken in as part of the process might not be protected. I know a lot of donors also do ancestry testing online, so their biodata is already out there. Many of them want the children to be able to find them, so they do like 23, well, not 23andMe anymore, but Ancestry.com and that kind of stuff. But Yeah, I mean that's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answers to that question, but it's a very provocative question that actually deserves deserves to be looked into. One of the things that gets me too is that for example, there's been a number of sales of very large fertility clinics to companies from China, private equity firms from China, that end up also owning this biological the cells that are in those stored in those facilities. And one particular clinic, the sale was just recently, within the past few years, denied because of the genetic information being sort of private information and not wanting to have it in the hands of a Chinese government or any other government for that matter. So, but another sale went through for another large clinic. So, but definitely something that would be an interesting project to continue to look at. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question is, in light of overturning of Roe v. Wade, and also the question of whether embryos are properties or if they're human life, where do you see this going within the next 10 years?
Oh, that's a big one.
Sorry.
That's a big question. I live in the state of Alabama right now. I'm from California, but I live in Alabama, and as you probably are aware, the Alabama Supreme Court recently decided that embryos are persons. And in the Montgomery legislature, I went and attended that hearing that was trying to analyze or trying to figure out how to make IVF available while not making it, something that people could be imprisoned for. And the conversations were very interesting. On the Republican side, they did not want to deal with the viability issue at all that the Democrats were trying to push, into the argument. And so they basically were trying to navigate where an embryo was a person. So an embryo might not be a person on ice in a cryogenic tank, but it is a person in a womb. And so therefore they can kind of map around or sort of weave their way around that, women's rights to bodily autonomy issue and rights to abortion issue by saying, well, if it's not in the womb yet, it's not yet a person until it's in there. But still, there's still some uncertainty as to where that law is going to go, because it actually, this legislation that saved IVF in the state of Alabama, and several clinics shut down for several months, including actually I probably shouldn't talk about this on camera, but we can talk about that afterwards. Several IVF clinics shut down, and finally one of them is shut down permanently, the Mobile clinic, with the incident of the embryos that had fallen on the floor occurred. That clinic shut down, and that was like one of the only clinics that was available in Mobile where it had where there's a large community of what's the word I'm trying to find. It's not one of the wealthier communities. It's a relatively poorer community, and where people actually did have access to care there. So of course it's one of the first clinics that gets shut down. But in any case, where is it going to go? I mean, I think it's hard to predict where it's going to go, but it's certainly up for debate. There's some legislators that want to see an end to IVF, and there's some that want to see IVF for all. So. And it also complicates the whole egg donation thing. Like, for example, what I said I would like to see a registry. Well, if you're living in a country where a registry could turn that information over to the state and you have a hostile state, well, that's going to be a problem. Who's going to want to have their information in a registry if it could be accessed by people that could do them harm? So I'm seeing the same thing with abortion. People who travel across borders, like for example, there was an Alabama woman who drove to Florida to receive an abortion care in Florida, and her phone app was tracked, and they knew exactly where she went. And so there's this level of surveillance that's occurring over reproduction and reproductive treatments and seeking care, whether it's abortion or any kind of treatment, that is cause for concern in terms of privacy and individual rights. So.
Well, unfortunately, we have to stop there, but please join me in thanking Diane for her wonderful presentation. Great, and we're at the end of the year, so I'm not sure if OBI has any further events. Are there any other OBI events that we should announce? No? Okay, well, we'll resume in the fall. And we'll see you then. Thanks.